It is a joy to have you here. It truly is. And I've looked forward to this. First of all, though, I think I have to just go over everybody's points because Chris Curry is also joining us, whose image you see here. And I give you each a quick bio. Chris has her master's in special education. She's a behavior specialist who works with families who have children on the spectrum. She helps develop IEPs, behavior programs, and she testifies in court to support parents with legal problems. She also is my partner. She and I run the Temple Grandin and Eustacia Cutler Autism Fund. And I could not have done all this without you, Chris. Now, here's Michelle, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to do anything without you too, Michelle. Just to fill everybody in, I know there should be a slide coming up that you can see, but basically you're the founder of Social Thinking, and you're a speech-language pathologist, and you specialize in the treatment of students with cognitive deficits, particularly students with autism.
Social cognitive.
Social cognitive.
Yeah.
You're right. I left social out. You're right. I didn't get all the words there. But I have to hear a note that social thinking is a methodology composed of a constellation of concepts, frameworks, strategies, and lessons that are all based on the current literature relating to normal development. Social emotional learning, social language, executive functioning. I'm hoping we're going to get back to talking about that. Social skills, problem skills, ASD, behavior skills, cognitive. Oh my goodness, the list goes on and on. Michelle, you conduct training throughout the country, helping teachers to develop effective treatment plans for children with autism.
And adults.
And adult. Oh, good. Okay. But there's more about you, Michelle. And your website is up there on a slide. So anybody who wants to go further into the problem, into knowing about Michelle, hop on and go to her website.
Yeah, we have a lot of free materials. You don't have to purchase something to start learning about social thinking. So we really pride ourselves in how much material we share on our website, socialthinking.com.
Oh, good for you, because this is exactly what today is about. I feel the same way. Parents deserve something free. And what I'm trying to do is put people like you on, and we talk together, and we will share insight. That's what it's about. And what strikes me about the two of us here today is that we each have a separate story, a little bit different story, but they're both about the effect of autism on social neurology. You are guiding Spectrum Young to a conscious understanding of what it is their social neurology lacks, why they're having difficulty socially. Why is it you and I, our neurology gives us this social contact for free, and it doesn't come for free for them. I, in the meantime, am guiding families and extended families of those young with a spectrum problem. And the parents also need to understand consciously about the same lack in the social neurology, because that lack is throwing them off. Autism is not a puzzle piece sitting out there alone. We, the family, the community, the teachers, we are the surrounding pieces that fit to it. We're social creatures. We're incomplete without each other. And it's not just that our Spectrum Young don't understand us. A great many people, that's parents, teachers, and certainly the mainstream, don't understand autism. It's a two-way social confusion. So what I'm hoping is we're going to lay out those two stories and see if we can complete the puzzle. So let's start with you, Michelle. You plunge in and tell us what you feel, what hits you as the most difficult challenge for those on the spectrum?
I guess I want to begin by saying my work is not exclusively focused on the spectrum, that I actually focus on social learning. And when you talk about social neurology, the brain, anything neurological is what the brain is all about, and learning comes from our brain. So we often focus our teaching on helping folks get better at social skills who are born to social learning weaknesses, which, tagging back to you, that's weak social neurology creates weak social learning. And then
what I was just going to add there are the words of Antonio Damasio, who hit on exactly this. And his words were, "We are not thinking beings who feel. We are feeling beings who think."
Exactly.
Mind is in the service of the body.
That's exactly right. And every person we work with has feelings, but they aren't all able to express their emotions, because emotion is the language layer that helps to make sense of that physical being that we are. And so then the question comes into treatment. And well, I started in the field of autism back in the 1970s, the late 70s, just picking a book up on it in college at UC Santa Barbara. And Dr. Cagle was there teaching a course on autism. It was one of the very few classes you can imagine in the 70s on autism. And Dr. Cagle went on to create pivotal response therapy, Dr. Robert Cagle. And I also at that university was in the speech and language department, and Dr. Carol Prudding is a person who is an early pioneer in social pragmatics and really getting in to the thinking and the understanding of the pragmatics. So I had Dr. Cagle teaching me behavioral principles, and then I had this amazing woman, Dr. Carol Prudding, who unfortunately died way too young, but she really opened the door to the study of our social beings as in terms of starting to understand it for treatment, not simply studying it in the terms of anthropology or cultural linguistics, but really what do we do as parents, treatment providers, to help our folks with social learning weaknesses get stronger at that. And so as a speech pathologist, I just was really intrigued with autism, but back in the 90s, pretty much everyone we were working with was minimally verbal and nonverbal. And then I did that for a number of years at Indiana University, where I was getting my master's, and then worked at their Indiana University Autism Center under Nancy Dalrymple. And there we were deinstitutionalizing adolescents who were put in institutions because Dr. Bettelheim had told the parents they caused autism.
Oh, well, he's a whole topic of his own. And you know what? It turned out in the end he was a fraud.
Yeah, of course.
None of the degrees that he claimed he had.
Yeah, of course.
Nobody had bothered to check. Yeah. But I was lucky enough to study under Erik Erikson.
Oh, wow.
Harvard.
Oh, my gosh.
And this is one of the things he talked about. And I thought about him as I went through all of your notes, particularly where you talked about whether the baby is focused on things rather than people.
Yeah.
One of the studies he had done with Piaget was that they realized that babies, the first thing they do is to focus on eyes. And babies like to look at human eyes. They also like, and it's why we make for them those big rag dolls that are those clown dolls with great big eyes.
Yeah.
They are attracted to eyes. And then he said, it is sort of a mean tick on the little baby. But we also tried to find out, would they respond to a row of horizontal dots? Yes. Now he said we gave them a row of vertical dots, and no, they do not respond.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between human beings and a thing.
So that's a great example of your social neurology. The baby is really just, they're expressing what their brain is making possible for them. And as we get into, I wanted to finish up one extra aspect of my story, and then I want to get into the social attention piece, because as a speech pathologist who focused on autism pretty exclusively, I ended up moving home to San Francisco and ended up working in hospitals, working with clients with head injuries and strokes in the late 80s and 90s. And there I learned about executive functioning and what happens when you lose skills due to head injury. And then in
Yes.
the mid-90s, I ended up in a high school district just to be on my children's school schedule. And that's when Asperger Syndrome had just come out. And I was using my very behavioral principles I'd been taught in autism to work with these kids who were showing up who appeared to have Asperger's. And my students were arguing with me. They didn't care about social skills. They didn't care how people felt. And they were trying to opt out of the social learning treatment or social skills treatment. And so I had to go rethink what I had learned. And I realized that language and cognition are a real game changer in treatment.
Yes, and I think that's exactly what we don't want, is to have these children withdraw. As we were talking earlier, I don't know whether you had come on yet, Chris and I were talking about the fact is some children want to learn, want to talk. I think always of Temple as a little girl, despite all the problems she had, and they were severe, she wanted to join us.
Yeah.
She wanted to talk.
Well, I think we see that through across the spectrum. I think it's certainly misunderstood.
But what about these ones who withdraw? What's your take on that? Why do they withdraw?
So let's talk about this research on social attention, because at the end of the day, I've been doing this now for 20 years. And what social thinking's about is we didn't start with a research question or funding through a system. I'm in private. I was working in the schools. I ended up in private practice. And now I'm kind of a self-funded business that allows me to spend time exploring whatever I want that I think is relevant. And I think that when we all drill down to treatment, we got to figure out what's the core, what's the base, where do we go? And I think social attention is so core, but just like any cognitive factor, social attention is part of our neurology. And so we have babies who are born to looking at the eyes, and then we have babies who are born to looking at objects. And if you see the slide here, we're just talking about attention in general, or put in social attention. You've got a human stimulus. Our brain perceives information, then we attend to it. And then as we attend to it, we either hold it in our working memory, which is our brain can hold on to ideas and juggle them, and we can consider many different things at once in order to figure out what to do about it. And then we also kick information into our long-term memory, which are, that's interesting for all of us, why some of our memories are so clear and why other things we can't remember at all historically. But we consider
you're also bringing up something that fascinates me, and that is conceptualism, the ability to understand the idea of something and generalize. Now, going back to what you just said about your putting the fact into the working memory and generalizing. You can't generalize on something unless you've got the idea of it.
Right. And I think, Temple does it.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
They don't get the idea.
Another way that I describe people with social learning challenges, which includes all people with autism, is that they have a conceptual learning disability. But
yes, they do.
However, different research talks about it in different ways. They can talk about this as central coherence. That's one of the terms in the research. And they'll talk about it as a processing bias. So if a person has a bias towards focusing on details, then they see the world through a set of details, and then they build upon those details to understand more broadly information. And Temple, I just heard her speak recently. She was talking about this as kind of bottoms-up learning, building from the details up to an idea. But most neurotypical people who have strong social learning, they see concepts, and then they have to drill down to try to pay attention to the details. And as Temple points out so well, you kind of need all of us to be able, the detail-oriented thinker is going to perhaps build a better mousetrap, and the concept person is going to keep a better idea on main ideas and generalization.
It also involves relevance, context. I think what's troubling is for a lot of these children is they have a lot of information, a lot of facts, and it's not always relevant.
Right. So now I want to jump over.
Now you have to be able to focus something, put it together, and
so
understand.
That's right. Want to bring in
go on.
Social attention.
Yes.
Because
is it attention, or is it not understanding the setup, the context?
I want to kind of explain the way that I see this. And Social attention, there's eye tracking research started by the Yale group, which is really awesome research. And then there's this idea of social attention, which is even bigger than eye tracking, because social attention, take the idea of a playground. Here's a picture of a playground. I'm a kid on a playground, school's starting around the country now. Kids go to the playground, and when kids approach that, the neurotypical kid, they see the structure, they see the kids, they understand who they like, who they don't know, and they attend broadly to all the things going on around them. And then a lot of my clients with social learning challenges, they go to the exact same spot in the playground. And the next slide shows that what they may see is, Chris, move it to the next one.
I'm doing the best I can here.
Okay. Okay, they see this. That they literally, their neurology does not drive them to the same visual imagery or understanding of the world.
It drives them to detail.
So they
see the detail of the playground in the same way that they see in a room, the floor, the ceiling, the chair. They see what's actually physically present.
They tend to focus more on the details of the object.
It's real. They don't, you see, what you and I are doing right now has no physical reality.
Right.
It's just where we're exchanging ideas, basically. And we're looking at each other. Even though we're looking at each other long distance through screens, we're still looking at each other and we're watching each other's eyes. And all of that is unspoken and has no physical reality.
So that's our social attention. So there's some really interesting research from 2011 where they studied a group of the babies and they found that, I think it was by 14 months old, there's a slide somewhere that shows this, by 14 months old, if babies spent 69% or more of their time focused on objects rather than people, they could predict accurately that 100% of the babies who focus 69% or more of their time on objects rather than people, 100% of them are autistic.
I believe that. That's an interesting statistic. And there is that strange stare in very little babies that doesn't somehow relate to one.
So there's another study I was looking at yesterday that was talking about babies who are more object-focused. Their attention is really object-focused, have less language learning than babies who have social focus. And if you think about it logically, and they have less, their prognosis for learning language is not as strong if they're focused on, or as richly, learning language as richly as they're focused on objects. Because if you think about it logically, if we understand people and we're born to understanding different people's mindsets, we start to understand that people don't understand what we're each thinking, and that we start communicating to share thoughts.
Yeah, and we try to get the idea that's in our mind. You and I are exchanging thoughts, trying to get the thoughts between us into each other's minds.
Right.
Again, that's also highly symbolic. Excuse me. Language is symbolic, and I think somehow it's connected to all of this.
So I had a really interesting question about that came up because in trying to figure out treatment for social skills, one of the big flaws I find in treatment is that we tend to group everybody with social skills problems into the same group, and we assume that everybody needs the same lesson. And that's in social thinking, I've really moved away from saying we teach social skills, because that's a very behavioral output, to saying we have to teach social thinking and related social skills, because the mind is the grand interpreter of information of each other, of each other's thoughts, motives, intentions, and that we have to be able to. So then, let me back up.
We're looking at the symptoms, and we're not looking at the cause.
Right. So I started to realize, and I think as I speak around the country, I ask audiences, like, do you know in your gut that even though your kids have the same label, and with the DSM-5, it's almost made things worse because everybody on the autism spectrum has the same label, which is not differentiating their needs at all, except if you look at the DSM-5, they talk about levels 1, 2, 3, but honestly, I've not heard anybody talk about that. I don't even see researchers using that language.
Michelle, just back up a little bit and explain the DSM-5 for anybody who might not know what that is?
That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual created by the American Psychological Association, and it is kind of the Bible of what our current thinking is in terms of if a person goes to a psychologist, counselor, psychiatrist for a diagnosis, they basically kind of choose the way in which we organize our diagnosis through the DSM. And the DSM came out with the 5th edition in May of 2013, where they removed Asperger Syndrome and they removed us thinking about PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise, and NOS, not otherwise specified. And they said, rather than see it as a series of different constellations, let's see it as one fluid spectrum. So they call it now the autism spectrum, ASD. And then they came up with levels 1, 2, 3. And level 1 is the highest functioning of autism. Level 2 are people who have a lot of adaptive functioning, kind of the moderate level. And the level 3 are the more severe social functioning. And that gets into also cognitive weaknesses, possibly. Sensory goes across all of this. But what I was trying to point out in talking about all of this was that in social thinking, we're dedicated to really focusing on treatment for people with solid to strong language as well as academic learning skills. And one of the things that I felt has been really important, and I started working on this in the late 90s, was how to make a scale of different levels of the social mind so we could actually be more surgical in the treatment. And one of the factors that I think is the most important factor I see in kind of determining this is looking at how alert someone is to social information. And so I had this question because one of the things I noticed was the less socially attuned somebody was, the less social attention they had, the more literal they were in their ability to interpret the world. And so I ended up developing this thing called the Cascade of Social Attention. And in the interest of time, what I didn't put in this talk, or as we talked about it, we are considering whether someone's detail focused versus conceptual. We're considering their sensory regulation abilities. But as we look at this, the cascade starts with, if you think about social attention, what is social attention? If you'll go back to that slide, that would be great.
Whoops, sorry. I got carried away with that.
If you go back to this cascade of social attention, when you and I enter into any kind of space that is shared by another person, we are aware of where we are. Dr. Peter Vermeulen out of Belgium does a beautiful job talking about context blindness. But the importance of situation or context being king. We're aware of where we are, what's going on around us. The second part of that is who is there and what do we know about them? And those two factors, situational awareness, what's going on around me, who is there, what do I know about them, what am I supposed to do in all of that, what do I know about myself as well, is what we're calling social attention. And what we tend to see,
that double thing, the awareness, because I think a lot of these children don't have the double awareness. We're aware of ourselves internally and how we feel. We're also aware of ourselves in relation to another person. How are you and I relating to each other right now?
The typical person, but not the person with social learning
I think
challenges.
until we look, I'm aware of that. But I don't think that a lot of the children on the spectrum cannot make that second step.
They don't necessarily even
that consciously.
They don't necessarily even make the first step. I mean, we certainly see now. In my mind, I'm going to show you my arm. In my mind, up here are people with solid social attention abilities, and then people on the spectrum. Some of them may have okay ability with social attention. Some of them may have pretty limited ability, and some of them appear to be very, very limited in their social attention. And so they may end up in the waiting room at my clinic, but they don't seem tuned into the waiting room. They seem tuned into the fact that there's a magazine in the corner. And so they're operating off of the focus of their attention and not in this situation, here are the expectations for this situation, and here are the people, and who do I know and who don't I know, and who will I go join or try to talk to. So what I was finding was the social attention seems to be directly related to our ability to interpret language. Because another huge factor with people with social learning, including the autism spectrum, is how literal a person is when they're interpreting information. And so I'm going to make sense of this in a minute, but if I walk into a place and I'm aware of where I am and I'm aware of who you are and I hear you speaking or I see you doing something, I make sense of your words and I make sense of your actions because I know where we are and who you are, and so I can start to make inferences about what you mean by what you say and do. But then I find what happens with my students who have very limited situational and social awareness is they're not tuning into where they are, necessarily the situation. They're not tuning into the people. So when people say something, they haven't tuned in to any kind of hidden agenda for them. There's no meaning to interpret because they haven't paid attention to the social or environmental or situational cues that the interpretation is based on. So those folks tend to be very, very literal in their interpretations.
There are two things involved in here. One of them is, yes, some of them are not tuned in at all. So they're not even aware that they're missing something. But then there are those that are kind of aware something's going on and they don't get it. They're very tense. And I think what happens to people when they're anxious, and we all do it, we get anxious, but we get tense. We can't think.
Why don't you relate Jennifer's story, Eustacia? That's a good one, I think, to pull in. Here's somebody who actually got it but knew she wasn't getting it.
Yes, she wasn't getting it. Oh, I wish I had her letter here in front. Why have I lost the image?
Oh, I'm sorry, because I disappeared on you. Go ahead. There I am.
Well, no, but I have. No, oh, there you are. Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jennifer McElway Myers. She was first place, she wrote me a long letter. And she said, the gist of it was, clearly this was something that meant a great deal to the people who were listening. And I don't understand what you were talking about at all. And we exchanged letters. You see, I think this also related to the mirror neurons, because she couldn't pick up on what the others, you see, mirror neurons will imitate for a whole group. It's why we, in a group, we're pulled together. It's why actors, we say they have great magnetism as an actor. What they're really doing is stirring up your mirror neurons. You are responding in imitation to what they are doing. It's the same reason we like sports. We want to watch that man I watched last night during the golf tournament. You want to watch that guy swing, and your neurons are actually going to swing with him. That's a very binding kind of neurology. And Jennifer could understand when I explained that to her. She could understand that. And I said, it doesn't matter, Jennifer, if you don't feel it. It only matters that you understand it. She did. And the next time I saw her, she looked very pretty. And she'd gotten married.
Which may not take you anywhere, Michelle. You're just going to have to jump in and figure out where you're going with that.
Yes, what I'm really talking about, I think what we're talking about, Michelle, is these things are all linked together.
Well, so that's the point of this cascade. So let me.
I like that word, cascade. Go on.
Allow me to go through this because I actually want to show how this is a little bit related to treatment. So one of the problems I think in our treatment of people with social learning challenges, folks on the autism spectrum, is that we all get so focused on details, we don't see the bigger picture. So we see how somebody's behaving or not behaving, and then we may say, well, that's inappropriate, we need to get rid of that behavior. But you might notice the person was not tuned in at all to where they were and who you were. So they were doing what was intuitive to them, but we just expected them to have this awareness to all of us and what the expectations of the situation were. And then they were supposed to interpret what's happening around them. And the next part on the
I think that's exactly where the parents go off. You see, they expect just what you're talking about. And I run into parents all the time who are terribly upset because their child is doing exactly what you're describing. And they no longer, the parents as a result, no longer know who they are. If my child doesn't know who I am, who am I?
It's a very hard thing because the next part on this is social self-awareness. One of the things we've noticed is that the weaker your ability to understand what's going on around you externally, the weaker your interpretation, the less aware you are of how people are perceiving you, because social self-awareness is a comparison. And so we start to see if you have very poor awareness of your own behavior, you're going to be producing social skills which are not in alignment with what's expected around you because you aren't comparing yourself to anyone else. So you're not noticing the cues of how close do people stand, what's their tone of voice, what do I do with my eyes to make sense of what's happening with you? And the eyes are so neurologically connected right into the whole process of this. I don't want to pull them out as it's not just a social skill thing. Our eyes are the driver
yes, they are.
Of joint attention, awareness. But then we also tend to see really strong trends in anxiety. And you were bringing this up with your discussion about Jennifer, because one of the things I think we've all learned a lot about, and we all knew this from the beginning, but the research has made it make a lot more sense, and that is a pervasive problem of people with social learning challenges is the anxiety they have to manage. Yes. All of these expectations, the world is happening around them. They're being assaulted by information and stimuli that their brain is not helping them to make sense of.
That's right.
And so we tend to see different buckets of anxiety, though, and that's important for treatment as well. Does the person tend to have anxiety about what's happening around them, change, transition? How do I predict the world I'm in? If I can't predict the world I am, I'm going to be really stressed out in the world because it just seems like all this stuff is happening and I can't make sense of it. Or we also see another type of anxiety with a different level of social learner, and that is they are more able to predict the world, but what they can't quite predict is how people are reacting to them because they're still not meeting others' expectations. So they're aware of the fact, because they have higher self-awareness, that they're getting rejected or not included in the same way.
This is the heartbreak, I think, for the high Asperger functioning ones.
Yeah.
I think always of Amy Klin out of that Yale study, telling about the boy who came up to him and said, the other guys have a language and I don't understand it.
Exactly. So if you go to the next slide, let me show you two kind of trends. We actually have about 5 different trends we talk about, but one kind of trend is the person who's interpreting information very, very literally. And why that's important, and one of the things I would like parents to be more aware of and treatment providers to be more aware of, is when we hear people talk about literal language, as a speech pathologist, to me that always meant I need to teach them to be unliteral. And now what I've learned is it didn't begin with literal language. It began with their awareness of what's going on around them. So if you go to the next slide, for the very literal person, you're going to see very weak situational awareness, weak perspective taking. You're going to see pervasive literal interpretations because they're not creating meaning out of what's happening with people and in their environment. Point is then see that as they lack the ability to really tune into other people's minds, the perspective taking, theory of mind, they're more literal, they're going to have very poor social self-awareness. That alone is a problem in treatment, because if you're not, you come to social skills therapy or social thinking therapy and you're a good soul, you want to be working on this, but you just have no awareness of what it is you need to be working on. Your behaviors are awkward and odd, and your anxiety tends to be, what we see is there's a connection in this, that this group tends to have much more anxiety about what's happening around me. They struggle to make to predict
This was
transitions
Jennifer.
and change.
She was trying to figure out what was going on around her that she didn't understand.
Yeah, yeah. And so you'll tend to see, so what that means in treatment is really poor social attention, very literal, poor self-awareness. You're going to see more awkward behaviors, and you're going to start to have to manage the anxiety through helping them predict the world by writing transition plans, Carol Gray's social stories, comic strip conversations, all the stuff that we know is good treatment for autism spectrum disorders at this very literal place can be very helpful, as a lot of our autism treatments have evolved to just naturally manage some of the anxiety. But we also have to look at treatment as affecting how do we get this person to have more joint attention, the ability to join in their attention. But it's not just the eyes looking at eyes. It's what's going on around me? What do I know about you? How do I start to being able to develop a concept of you?
Well, this is where I wish you'd develop that in relation to parents. This is where, because I believe the more we get all this information out on the table, the better we'll work with it. At least we may not have the answer, but we won't have the answer if we don't get it out where we can look at it.
I work with, yeah.
All right, that's all. I just to follow up on that for parents.
I work a lot with parents. At my clinic that I have, I see very few. I have a very small clinic, but we have a couple of other clinics that other people run that I help to supervise a little bit. But when I left the schools and went into private practice, I'd been in autism for many years, and I knew that none of us interventionists, the professionals, are going to make much change without impacting parents' understanding. And what I've learned over the years is that parents are certainly, we certainly sit down with parents and tell them diagnostic labels, but we don't explain what those labels really mean. And so parents don't necessarily understand that they can see their child doing behaviors or participating in a way that is not the accepted way for the culture, the standard.
Yeah.
But they don't understand necessarily that this is from a social cognitive weakness, that their social learning is not
personal.
It's not personal. And
it's not personal. That's where they get confused.
People with the same labels may not have the same level of problem. And so if you go to the next level of slide, then we'll look at the trend 2. And in trend 2, we're going to look at a type of people that were formally described, and we still describe them as more Asperger Syndrome, ADHD, murky, undiagnosed, gifted and talented, but socially a little bit awkward. Parents describe them as smart but clueless. And this person has it may not be great, but it's solid social interpretation, yet compelling, subtle, and significant social challenges relating to peers. So let me show you the cascade for this group.
Also, I would just add to that immaturity. I think what I've seen in a lot of Asperger's, they will be very bright. They'll be in their late teens or early 20s, and socially they're like 8 years old. They haven't somehow made the transition. They've only gotten there's an immaturity. They've only gotten that far.
Well, think about the definition of maturity. So I've wrestled with all these concepts.
Yes.
So what I consider somebody who's mature is basically at the social learning capacity expected for their age group. Somebody who's really immature is perhaps having social learning weaknesses of a younger age group, but they're biologically at an older age.
Yes.
There's a gap in there. And then we have these pedantic kids who look very mature. They're using social rules for an older age group, but actually they're using language of an older age group. They're using intellect of an older age group, but they're not understanding their audience, and so they're sounding what Tony Atwood has always said, the little professor syndrome.
Yes, because they're holding forth. They're not conversing.
I think maturity really has a lot to do with our social learning abilities, and in my world, I see this spectrum of social functioning that the autism spectrum, you can have really weak social functioning, and you come up to here, and this is the autism spectrum, but there's a whole nother spectrum of people in here that are really subtle but significantly challenged. And that's who this Cascade is about. They have solid situational awareness, solid perspective taking, not fantastic, not great, but they're very aware of people's thoughts and opinions is different from their own. So they are getting into some abstract interpretations, yet they can be subtly more literal. Like a man in his 40s who I'm a pen pal with recently wrote me and he said, "What does it mean when someone says they're not offended?" And I said, "Oh, it totally means they are offended. They're just planning on getting over it quickly." And those are the little things that throw him, because he does tend to bend on being literal, even though he's quite sophisticated, very well read. He obviously interprets, but he gets thrown by the nuances of the subtle world. And
here's what, now do you run into parents with some of these traits?
I run into teachers with these traits. That is principals.
Because you're describing fathers that I've talked to.
And mothers.
And mothers, yes.
Yes, and there's people who head up Silicon Valley companies who have these traits, but they're great detail thinkers, and they're great at making things launch. But when it comes to, here's the kicker now, you've got fairly solid situational social attention. Your interpretations are pretty good. You've got solid social awareness, so you understand how people are treating you. And if they're not treating you in the way that you think you should be treated because your intentions are good, like I've thought about, I work with a lot of adults who are fired because they went to their boss.
Because they can't handle this working in the business.
Well, they offend people because this level, at Trend 2, this level, they tend to be very... Let me finish this, and then let me finish these couple ideas, and then I want to talk about what I call the forgiveness factor.
Okay.
If you've got solid social awareness, it doesn't mean you're great socially. A lot of my clients do things subtly wrong. So they do things, they may stand 1 foot further back from the group. They may talk too much about themselves, but they understand some level of reciprocity, but they're missing the subtlety of how to engage in it. And so what they're going to see is people are having these more subtle but significant kind of weird thoughts about their behavior and not including them in the same way or being offended by them. And then my clients end up with a lot of social anxiety because they don't know what they're doing wrong because it's at such a nuanced level. So if you think about the first trend I talked about, these guys need to learn social rules. They need to learn what we consider the really obvious stuff about turn taking and all. And when you get to Trend 2, they need to learn the much more subtle things like, why is it that people unbutton the top button on their shirts? You know, most guys. Like, why don't we all wear our shirts all the way buttoned up? You know, what's the meaning in fashion? What's the meaning in our hairstyles that we carry is all carried through the subtle. And so that they need a completely different treatment in terms, and when people go to pair them together, so they say, oh, everybody's autism spectrum, so let's put the way more literal, way more spaced out, unaware kids who don't really know what the social world's about, mix them in with these kids who have much more social self-awareness into the same treatment group. It is such a waste of money, and it
doesn't work. Yes.
The higher function, this particular group, the Trend 2 group, can actually be quite offended because they think that the adult who put them in that group thinks they function the same as the more obviously.
And you know what? They're justified in their offense.
It's tricky because
it's very tricky because the authority can hide behind other levels. So you see, you've got double games going on.
And we have no problem in academics talking about a high reading group, a moderate reading group, a low reading group, a weak math student, a gifted math student. We have no trouble talking about that meeting.
Where the problem is.
But when it comes to social, we're all kind of creeped out talking about someone's social abilities, yet we figure them out so quickly. There was a research article that's just been published in the last few months. And I don't have the article in front of me, but I just read it, and they were saying they showed pictures, videos, they showed still pictures, videos, they had people listen to audio recordings, And there was one more thing they showed to typical neurotypical adults who have no training in autism or related social disabilities. And they showed the stimulus, whether it's a social video of the person, listen to their voice, listen to their audio tape for 1 second and 3 seconds. And they had these people rate whether they were watching neurotypical folks, video clips, or watching people with autism spectrum, and they had them rate their social abilities. And the raters were incredibly accurate by only watching 1 to 3 seconds of information, because one of the things every person does out there pretty darn well is figure out all of us are born diagnosticians of people's social abilities. If you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, we had to be aware of who was around us and what the situation was to avoid the predator.
Absolutely.
And then our brain just kept evolving. And so the one thing that...
And we have to get along in the tribe.
Everyone can see in their gut is who's socially competent and who's not. And even though we can all see it, whether you're a typically developing peer, they have research on preschool children can identify who's got differences in social behavior, that you don't have to have a degree to understand this. But when it comes to treatment, we often throw out all that information and we just treat it as one big bucket. And it drives me crazy.
Wow, you're
because
absolutely right.
we can do so much better treatment with our really literal kids to help them get a better sense of the social world and not just focus on social skills. We need to move away from just focusing on a behavioral output to how do you interpret information, because social, you've got to interpret information to respond to it. And then,
well, I couldn't agree with you more. I've been doing a social history of autism. I'm writing it.
Oh, interesting.
And this is autism is old. We've always had it. And you are describing, each culture works this out a little differently, but they're always the same things. And you have always the systemizers who want to put it into a system and it will not fit. But they kind of jam it into the system. And for some reason, we go along with the system and we don't realize it's one-on-one. It doesn't work. It doesn't lend itself to a tidy system. And it's one of the reasons why research doesn't work with it. There's no way to fund it.
What do you mean by I'm not
by
quite
funding by research? Research is all done with grants.
Yeah.
And most grants are a business contract.
Right.
And there's no way to make up a contract to go after what we're talking about right now.
Yeah. Well, I travel around the world. I'll be leaving in 2 weeks to go to Australia, Singapore, Philippines. I've spoken in a lot of different continents on social thinking, because even though you think of social skills as cultural, actually what we're talking about, like this cascade of social attention, this is humanity.
It's humanity. It's the same the world over.
It's all around. And so I can go in and teach social thinking about how do we read intentions and how do we understand the other person and what's each of our egos about as we're interpreting information, and how do we, when you think about social's a judgment. Social is a judgment. We impose judgments on each other.
Something's coming up here. Wait a minute. What does this say?
Chris is gone. Her internet went down. So
she went down. So
it's okay. You guys can still talk.
Okay.
We're still on.
We lost Chris. I just was trying to figure out what this mysterious message was. I'm the host now. She's gone. We lost her.
All right. Well, you do wonderfully as a host. But I do think it's interesting as we think of...
I don't know now that Chris is gone, because what I want to do is I thought we have got 10 minutes left, and I was hoping to get in some questions.
Okay.
But it's now okay. I don't have the questions. Chris is handling that. If we've lost her, I don't know how we can get at the questions.
Eustacia, you and I have never lacked for a good conversation as we've met after conferences.
Yes. Well, I think what I love is all the things that you're talking about fit in with all the things that we're both, as I say, we're approaching it. I'm looking at parents most of the time, and I see their anxiety and their loss of their own identity. They no longer know who is the person they thought they were because of their confusion. over their child who doesn't respond to them. And it's interesting. I talked to a close friend of mine. Her mother had Alzheimer's for 6 years and didn't know her. And it was a heartbreak. But she knew who her mother was, who her mother had been.
Yeah.
Now, when you have a young child who doesn't know who you are, which is probably has the neurology that's lost in Alzheimer's is probably not unlike the neurology that hasn't developed.
I do think our folks.
You follow what I'm saying?
I think our folks. I imagine there's definitely exceptions, but when I worked with folks with autism coming out of institutions who were considered very classically autistic, they were very aware of who was around them, and they treated people differently. But I think one of the compelling problems for parents with kids with social problems is that if I have a math disability, if I close the math book, if you don't give me any math problems, I look fine. But you can never close a social disability because we're all interpreting each other all the time.
That's right.
And then some of the work we've done in social thinking that people can see on our website is we've shown how the social mind is very actively involved in academics. So reading comprehension of literature involves perspective taking.
Language itself is social.
Absolutely. So now what happens is as our kids are aging up, we see them and parents see them getting better. They're improving, just like all children get better and better at whatever. So parents see kids, even with more involved autism, improving. But the problem is the expectations of the peer group keep racing further ahead. And I think this is so hard for parents because they want to focus on their child improving, but then it's like society doesn't really appreciate it because social's expectations are constantly shifting. They don't just shift across our childhood. We expect different behavior out of 20-year-olds than we expect out of 30-year-olds. We expect 50-year-olds to behave differently.
Appropriate to and one of the interesting things that Dr. Kathy Lord has talked about is the importance of children on the spectrum learning at the same age that other children are learning. That helps. They coordinate, because this I know helped. The reason I think of it is because it helped a great deal with Temple. She was mainstreamed at 5 into the local school, and those children all played together all the time. So a certain amount of it sank in. It didn't all go in. But she said, I had to learn to play the games by their rules or they wouldn't let me play.
And not everybody's Temple, so not everyone is going to be.
They might not get that.
Because Temple is very, very intellectually bright.
Yes, she is.
And so I think a really, really bright person.
Yeah.
A really bright person.
I keep losing you. I don't know what's happening.
She's there. Chris is trying to get back.
Oh,
I'm back, but I can't get in. It's okay. I'm here. Sorry. Just keep going.
Okay.
Keep going.
But, Michelle's gone.
No, I'm here.
Oh, no, there you are. I see you in a little frame, not in a big frame.
I think what's important, I think in terms of learning, I think a lot about this because I also specialize in transition to adulthood and living as an adult.
Yes,
and I think for parents, it's really trying to understand what is that, like when everyone talks about, researchers talk about best outcome, define it. What do you mean by best outcome? Because it's going to be different.
I don't know either. It's going to be different for
every student.
Person.
But what we do in the United States and a lot of countries is we consider that everyone should just become very normal. And then we don't have
What is normal?
What is
normal for what?
Exactly.
That's what I want to know.
So how do we figure out education? Because if I'm working with a very, very literal student who is focused on details and has very poor self-awareness and not aware of what's going on around them, they're also going to have really poor critical thinking. So if you're going to put them in a curriculum that's all about critical thinking, you're forcing them to space out because they can't figure it out. They can't. There are literal. So I think where Temple might have done really well in being mainstream in certain classes, other kids who have more challenges with their intellect would not necessarily do as well.
See, a lot of it had to do with the teacher. She and I talked every day. It was always one-on-one.
Sure.
The class was small.
Yeah.
And when it was too much of a tempo, I'd come and pick her up at the school and take her home. But she was conscious of the other children, and again, it's that business of wanting to be part of the group. She wanted to be part of it, so she had to learn their rules.
Well, and I think you have to be a little careful with that, because my clients who don't do as well, it's not necessarily that they don't want it, but their neurology is not there. I think there's a combination, and we don't understand it fully, but there's definitely an interplay between social cognition and what I call academic, more the measured IQ.
You may be right, yeah. Whatever that is.
The stronger that measured IQ, the more they can cognitively think around their social problem. But, as you and I have talked about, our folks, as we see them across adulthood, people continue to get better with age in their ability to understand the social world. There is this piece I want to talk about, though, called the forgiveness factor, and maybe we'll wrap up around this.
We have about 4 minutes. Yeah, 4 minutes. So
you said you wanted to talk about the forgiveness, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Because I think what I see is that the more obviously awkward a person's social behavior, the more it triggers the people around them to be sensitive to the fact that there's something going on with that person neurology that's creating this awkward behavior. And so in school, children tend to want to help the kid who's got the obvious social challenge. But when you get to the folks who don't appear super awkward, they're subtly off. They're what they, in Silicon Valley, they call the geek syndrome, or they've got a subtle air of social difference. The peer group can't, and the teachers and the principal can't figure out that person may have a social learning difference. And rather than forgive them and try to help them, they hold them accountable for every little thing they do that is offensive to others as social judgment. And so what we tend to see is this second trend that has higher, solid situational awareness, social attention, self-awareness, that they actually can be treated much worse than someone who may be very bright with an obvious social disability, because that people can't make sense of the fact that this is actually a learning system weakness that is more subtle but significant. So we have to be tuned into that.
I think the more you get that said, that's very important to get said. And I will treasure your words and say them to parents, if I may. I'll give you credit for it.
Oh, sure. But I think we have to be really sensitive.
I think there is a slippage right there, and it can be heartbreaking.
Because I think for parents of kids whose kids look more neurotypical, we hold those kids accountable, and so we see those kids as having bigger behavior problems because people think that they're saying offensive things to their teacher on purpose.
On purpose, yes.
When they may not be realizing it at all.
It's not personal. It's not personal.
So I love your focus on parents, and I'm very focused on. I don't think teachers, psychologists, speech pathologists, OTs, behaviorists. None of us are trained none of us receive very good training in university around social. So I think parents and teachers and all professionals need to be tuning in more.
I do too. And to be continued.
Yeah.
I'd love to do it again.
That was fun.
So thank you very, very much.
And I also want to mention, while you're on, Eustacia, you and I had a great time meeting with my colleague Pam Crook at a restaurant in New York a few months ago. And we talked about you coming and being the keynote speaker at our International Social Thinking Providers Conference we do every year in San Francisco. So you've signed on and agreed to come June 25th, 2016 to San Francisco.
Oh, good. I'd love to.
Remember that?
Yes,
to speak.
Now that you said it, I forgot that. I'd love to.
And talk about.
We'll come with more information by that time.
And you'll be the keynote, so you'll have the mic to yourself for a few hours to share with us your wisdom. So I look forward to that.
Me too. And I can't tell you how much this hour has meant. And I know how many people, some signed up today and have been watching through this, but this hour will stay there on the Temple Grand and Eustacia Cutler website there, so that they can turn to you anytime, for free. All they have to do is plug in, and they can deal you.
Great.
And I know they will.
And those who signed on late, please go check out our website, socialthinking.com, and see that we have a lot of free information under our articles bucket for people to read more about all the stuff we've been talking about today. Thank you, guys. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.